So by now we already know how we can accept HMR updates by using method accept and apply them to our page. And this method accept has a few signatures. First one allows us to accept updates of the model itself, and the other signature allows us to accept updates from dependencies of this module. In other words, from those modules that are imported in this module, like we're doing in here, where we are monitoring changes inside of submodule.js. But there can be such situations where when modules are updated and updates are applied in a browser, those updates might also leave some kind of side effects. For example, those updates might modify DOM structure or change some data in local storage of the browser. Or even a simple console log statement can also be considered a side effect. And sometimes before applying updates of the module in a browser, we need to run some kind of a code which would clean up those side effects left from previous executions of this module. It might sound complicated, but in fact, it is really simple. Let's consider one example. I'm going to create variable styles, and then let's declare the function addStyleSheet, which is basically going to add styles into head element on the page. So in here, I'm going to use DOM API to create DOM element which corresponds to the style tag. And then we're going to assign arbitrary styles to the inner HTML property. For example, let's make background color of the body indigo and text color will be white. And then all we have to do is to append this style element to the head element, like so, by using method append child. And of course, to apply these changes, we have to execute this function once current module will be loaded in the browser. So let's call the function addStyleSheet right here. And also let's open up index.html, and in here we'll add h1 element. So in the browser we see that those styles were applied, and if we take a look at the head element, at the end we can see that style element that we have just added. So far it looks good, but what is going to happen if we're going to modify the styles in any way? For example, let's change the color on yellow and take a look in the browser. The color was properly applied to the page by using hot module replacement, but in fact if we take a look at the DOM structure, here we have two style elements. So the previous style element was not removed, and the new one was just added. So the previous execution of this module has left side effect in the DOM by adding style element, but right after we have updated those styles, the previous style tag was not removed. So it produced so-called side effect, but we didn't clean up that side effect before applying new updates and inserting new style element. And as you may have guessed, anytime we're going to do any kind of changes to our module, we're going to get the new style element appended to head element. So now let's see how we can actually clean up after ourselves. And anytime we're going to modify this module, the previous style tag will be removed and the new one will be appended. And for that, let's create new function, call it remove style sheet. And all this function is going to do is basically remove styles DOM element by calling remove method like this. But the question is, where do we actually need to call this function remove style sheet? And since this function has to be executed right before we're going to receive new HMR updates, Vite provides us with another method called dispose that we also call on the hot object. And the closure, which will be passed into this method, should execute all necessary cleanup code to get rid of previous side effects. So this is exactly the place where we can call our function remove style sheet to remove style DOM element. So now before going back to the browser, let's actually reset these styles as they were initially. Let's also do a full page refresh to have only one style element on the page. So now after I'm going to modify this module, in the browser what we will actually see is that before appending updated styles onto the page, the previous style element was removed, because that function remove style sheet was executed inside of a closure of the method dispose, which cleaned up our previous side effect before appending new element. And just to see at what time those functions are executed, let's just place arbitrary console log statement into function addStyleSheet as well as remove style sheet. So on the initial page load, our module was executed and called function add style sheet, and therefore new styles were applied to the page. And after any subsequent modifications of this module, we're going to see that before applying new updates, our function remove style sheet was executed thanks to that method dispose that we have called on the hot object. So the previous styles were removed, and then the new styles were added. And this way we end up only with one style element on the page. Let's go back to the editor and remove these two console log statements. So by now we know how we can accept hot module updates by using method accept, as well as how to remove any side effects before applying new updates by using function dispose. And now a couple of words about standard Vite events that we can listen to. And there are several events that we can listen to, and all of them are shown on this documentation page. So for demonstration purposes, let's just register listeners for some of these events. As the first parameter, we have to specify an event name. I'm going to use before update event. And as a second parameter, we're passing the handler, which is going to take some data received from the server. Let's just print out this data in the console, and then duplicate this piece of code a couple more times to register listeners for other events, such as for after update and for the error event, like this. And just to make it clear which console log statement corresponds to which listener, I'm going to add in here labels: before update, after update, and error. So again, initially there are no logs that came from those listeners because none of those events were fired on the initial page load, because they will be fired once we're gonna modify the module. So let's do just that. I'm gonna go ahead and change the color of the background. And then in a browser, we can see that firstly we have received the log which came from the before update event listener with some metadata about the module which was updated, when it was updated, and the path to this module. So this log was printed right before we have applied HMR update, and the after update log was printed after we have applied HMR updates. And this event handler also received the same object which describes the module which was updated. And just to trigger the error event, we have to make syntax error in this module. And then in the console we're gonna see that the error was printed, which means the error handler was executed. And the data that we have received in here contains the full description of the error. And by the way, the same error was displayed right here. And this is how we can leverage those default events to be able to hook into HMR process and execute particular code at the different stages of HMR updates.